Hello, my name is Philip Rodriguez, and I'm enrolled in History 530 in Latin America at the University of Eastern Washington University. And for my historiography, I've decided to dive into the ambiguous boundaries of the origins of caste in Spanish colonial America. And I found this to be a very complicated and challenging project. Um, just about as complex as looking at this image right here. The caste system in 18th century Mexico. It's as varied and nebulous as what we see happening in these images here from these casta paintings. What I found is that when I started this project, that the complexity of this topic was somewhat overwhelming. That there is such a fluidity of caste throughout Latin America based upon racial features or miscegenation or changes through time as countries went through transculturation or became industrialized, and there was a move from rural to urban. And that many variations exist throughout Latin America when you're evaluating caste, from geography to immigration patterns to settlement patterns. So the origins of caste in Latin America also, there's a level of complexity that was already stated. Again, the fluidity of ancestry, uh, of class identification, right? So it's not just caste, but it's also caste transitioning into class, where these ambiguous or not so ambiguous boundaries are drawn. Um, so that is a real challenge of tackling this subject. So the context of what we're studying here, or what I attempted to pull back the layers on, is what is caste? Well, that was a question that I've always asked, and it just I never get a satisfactory answer. Um, Isabel Wilkerson, in her Pulitzer Prize-winning book, "The Origins of Our Discontents," Caste, "The Origins of Our Discontents," says that it's a, quote, "wordless usher in a darkened theater, guiding us to our assigned seats for the performance." Um, so it doesn't say much, which speaks to the ambiguity of caste. And it really lends itself to being described as an artificial construction. It's fixed and embedded ranking of human value based on superiority of some and the inferiority of others. It's cultural. It's arbitrary boundaries. There's no biology essentially that enables this. It's not biology that enables liberty. Um, um, it's culture that forbids, right? Biology enables liberty, culture forbids and constructs groupings. So this is not necessarily a natural formation. In Latin America, mostly based, it seems, on racial features, but also has high levels of fluidity. And as I discovered in my study, it gets complex. So, setting the context for this study, we are looking generally at the 16th through the 19th centuries, though I do dabble in the 20th century a little bit. Where are we in the world? The Americas, a particular focused on Catholic colonies of Spanish colonial America and Portuguese and South America. We look at Brazil. I also use the North American experience lightly as a foil, just to compare and contrast the level of variability across the Americas. Who's involved? Well, the entire population of Latin America from top to bottom, all up and down the social ladder, has an expected role to play. And then one caveat I have before we go any further, and when we talk about who, it's not homogeneous. There's across Latin America, and that's what makes it very challenging. So the main points in my examination, which did cause some hair pulling for sure, is the high variability of social and economic constructs of caste. So what I found was racial appearance, certainly first and foremost, skin tone and facial structure continuums, but within that continuum, it's a little confusing. Matrimonial arrangements, endogamy, and miscegenation, either forced or consensual, seems to play a heavy role. Um, and a lot of these are symbiotic as well. One plays off the other, so it's hard to rank which one is, you know, the most important or plays the heaviest role. Class and property ownership certainly come up, as well as caste moves to class throughout the history of Latin America. And with that comes political and bureaucratic power in some regions that I looked at. Of course, ancestry also plays into this, family names. And then generally, I concluded my study with a general summary of just the inherent problems in trying to quantify such a nuanced and fluid subject. It was certainly a challenge, and there's certainly not one way to go about examining this topic. So my first argument or observation is the racial features seem to be the most predominant marker of caste. Variation in color elasticity seems to come out frequently in the works that I looked at. There's a high degree of fluidity in most parts of Latin America. In one scholar says, in turn, scholars have identified a number of different kinds of racial fluidity throughout Latin America, including temporal, contextual, referential, and categorical fluidity. So clearly, a complex topic. There was a look at a Peruvian Native American group, which I am probably going to mispronounce their name, but the Muquiañinos, lo siento, in 1910, recognizing that, for example, that little can be deduced concerning ancestry or social position from physical appearance alone. And this came from a State Department study by Richard Adams. So there we see that race and physical appearance, we just can't deduce a lot in his overview of the situation. But then we move to Mexico in a demographic studies in 1979 of records that dated back to 1792. And then in southern Mexico, it's apparent that race, quote, race remained a strong principle of social stratification, even in the relatively commercial and proto-industrial economy of colonial Oaxaca. I think I'm saying that right. So there's this high degree of variability across Latin America when we look at race and what that means. And we're going to get a little bit more into that because it's closely tied to a lot of other topics as we go. Observation number 2, miscegenation and endogamy variations. So, we have a quote from Professor Ruth Hill at the University of Virginia, where she says or suggests that social hierarchy is not natural, essential, or impermeable in any way. And that marriage or miscegenation that was consensual or by force certainly plays a significant role in trying to better understand caste fluidity. We see in some parts of Latin America a positive conception of miscegenation amongst, quote, Africans, Spanish, Portuguese, and for that many, any other Europeans along more optimistic lines as the means of whitening and trying to improve Latin America. There seems to be an allowance for having sexual relations, particularly with a male European with a colored female. I also noticed that reversing that, the inverse, having a male colored with a white female, is not so easily accepted by these folks, which didn't quite make much sense to me. in biologically speaking, because the outcome is the same. But so definitely the role of patriarchy, patriarchal and racist views come in there. When we look at Brazil in another study, we see a concern for whitening as well, and that we have a non-white demographic preponderance, which consisted of and encouraged European immigration and betting on a constructive miscegenation in which white genes were believed to be stronger. And we also, as we dive into this topic, as I dove into this topic, we kind of find that these intermarriages and miscegenation was rarely consensual, and not as deliberate as some may think. There are some studies out there, particularly from a professor from Stanford. This is Professor Voss here, who says that a low frequency of colonial households, generally 2% and rarely as great as 23%, were intermarried, or mentioned this in the archival records. Instead, concubinage, slavery, and servitude were likely to have been the most common means of miscegenation. So, this also has a great variation. Moving on to my third point I make in this paper is political or class paradigms. A shift from caste to class seems to be happening in Latin America. And also in a study I read on Peruvian population of natives in a Peruvian village, district versus communal organization stands out as agents that would determine one's place, and then kind of a blending of those two. A merging of those two, if you will. Again, back to Richard Adams in his State Department study of the Peruvian village. Usufruct of communal lands, so by natives, and the allowance of private property ownership later in their history, it enables natives in later history to become a part of the wealthier class. So we do see fluidity there. And there seems to be also a deeply entrenched dichotomy between those who work with their hands and those who do not. So I mention this point because I think it really brings to light the class paradigm and separation of class based upon manual to clerical or bureaucratic functions. That seems to really stand out in Latin America as a major distinction of where you stand on the social hierarchy. And there was a quote that I came across that really stands out as well, is that money, quote unquote, whitens in Latin America. We see this over and over again. This was mentioned in the case of a study in Cuba that I read about. So clearly, there's a lot more than just race that's going on here. My fourth observation was this identification of or affinity to your ancestry. And there's high levels of variability across here, whether this matters or not. So we have a tenuous relationship here. So, for example, in Brazil, scholars have found that considerable percentage of self-identified whites reported having African ancestry, as well as racial identification of one's parents. Just because you identified one parent as African ancestor did not always lead to the expected racial identification for the children. So, so we have a high level of racial fluidity, particularly in Brazil, where in some other parts of Latin America, we do not. And then we look even further north as a foil here and look at the northern colonies of England. We see a really strict rigidity in particularly one-drop codes for enslaved Africans who came to the North American colonies of England. So just quite a contrast between these two colonial experiences. My last observation in this paper was just the absolute complexity and variation in what was being researched here. Um, Clearly, Latin America is far from being homogeneous. There's substantial variations and just a lot of ambiguity. So, in Latin America, we see, for example, a variation on, hoisting up the idea of a mixed race to hybrid as a prime directive for nation building later. This is particularly after the revolutionary period. In some parts, most parts, and others, like Argentina and Costa Rica, according to a study, they did not value that. Um, Race is a physical, um, outwardly continuum, the somatic view of people, right? Hair color, hairstyle, nose shape, tone of skin, color tone. These continuums stand out as the most significant factor in judging castes. And again, there's a high degree of variability and subjectivity depending upon what part of Latin America you're looking at and dependent upon the immigration population, and class structures as well, which play a major factor in directing one's caste, and familial ties. We have a fluid paradigm dependent upon miscegenation and the whitening of an individual's genetics. Um, you know, um, Seems like, visible signs of race play a much more important part in South America and Brazil, for example, than does ancestry, where in other parts of Latin America, ancestry is everything. Um, I think we have to mention the role of transculturation in shifting caste and attitudes, as we have this blending of cultures and this kind of, um, this new hybrid, um, of human being, if you will, the American, developing, many during the revolutionary period carry the flag of elevating their status because they are American. There's something novel with what they're doing and who they are. And this affects attitudes about caste and race. So I think ultimately what I got out of this was that one approach, whether it's an economic look or political or racial, is not going to bear fruit nor provide the appropriate context. And many of the sources that are cited in my bibliography, in conclusion, stated the same thing. So, my remarks. Why did I pick this topic? Well, I really found its ambiguity and challenging variety. They really intrigued me. I think asking these types of questions about caste and race and economy give us the ability to help better understand modern social and economic constructs, particularly in Latin America and the issues we have. And when we talk about immigration and we look at why do people come to us and who's coming to us, I think looking at this issue kind of helps give us more context. And also, I think it speaks generally to human nature and what quite the opposite of what Lincoln said, but hearkening back to Lincoln, the lesser angels of our nature seem to come out here with these rather ambiguous and an artificial construction of caste, that again is doesn't really have any biological gravity. It's just simply cultural construct to ensure power for a certain group of people and superiority and inferiority and weakness for others. Um, so what I've learned is it's a nebulous concept. It's a nuanced study. Clearly, in the context of taking this master's program, I'm not going to be able to, you know, make any new ground here. That it involves deep dives into demographic archives and studies of marriage records and documents, as all history does. There's great variability across Latin America, which is a real challenge. So you can't just look at one area and think, "Oh, this is the way it is across everywhere," across the entirety of Latin America. So there's not one focus you can take. You have to, look at the large variety of topics, economy, politics, race, in order to better understand it. And honestly, I just felt I was in over my head as I began to dig deeply into this. And I think I've just, with this short historiography, of just hit the tip of the iceberg. Here are my sources for my project, and I want to thank you for hearing me out. Thank you.